Yeah, I heard there are people on TikTok or online that actually record or themselves being laid off or actually take the time to reflect immediately when it's occurred. And I wanted to take a look at that and respond to some. So let's start this off. Let's see what happens. Let's see what they have to say.
Hello. I was a federal worker.
I was one of the thousands of federal workers terminated this weekend. Let's talk about it.
Literally every single day, it's something. Every single day, I am waking up and dreading going to work because I don't know if I'm going to have a job or not.
And I wanted to come on here as one of the thousands of federal employees who lost their job with the federal government this weekend. I was removed from my position through an email from an unrecognized HR account from my agency around 1 p.m. on Saturday. I have gone through the entire range of emotions this past weekend. There is a lot of sadness in my heart. There is also a lot of anger.
Yeah, I guess I kind of saw that coming. The gal before her said she literally doesn't know if she's going to have a job every day. Well, kind of welcome to my world or the world of STEM because I felt that way a lot. I've had multiple jobs. I've had to be the new guy many times. Much of that's because I've been a consultant a good portion of my career, but the other times it's just the nature of how STEM has been, how tech has been. It's a regular occurrence when you're in the private sector and you're dealing with the profit motive. And we're often the victims of what's happening in the federal government. These folks don't recognize where money comes from. Their entire paycheck comes from taxes or the money that the government just prints out of nowhere. And I'm related to some of these folks. They think that they actually pay taxes when 100% of their paycheck comes from taxes. Government is an expense. Government, it doesn't produce anything. It doesn't even produce its own planes, trains, and automobiles. They have to contract that out too. Well, let's continue.
I served 14 years in the Air Force. I was a federal employee for over 6 years. That's over 20 years of my life working for the federal government. And I was recently fired by Donald Trump because I was on supervisor probation. So I was already tenured.
All right. So he's saying he was already tenured. He just got a new job. And when you switch into a new job, yeah, I'm related to someone who was promoted. And they have like 14 years of experience working for the federal government. They were promoted to a new level. And because they were promoted, they're on probation. And so one of the easy ways to get rid of folks is just say, well, let's get rid of the folks who are on probation. Chances are this guy will end up coming back because when you're promoted, you were considered valuable. 14 years in the military, 6 years federal service as a civil servant. He'll find something else. If not, you've got 20 years of experience with basically two employers, one employer, the federal government the whole time, one employer. If I had 20 years of uninterrupted paychecks, I could retire. If I had 20 years of uninterrupted paychecks, I could retire. But I didn't have that, and yet I'm still in an okay situation, but I really didn't expect at this point in my life things would just be okay. I thought I'd be in a much better situation, have a greater level of financial peace. I have some peace now, but this is not the expectation I would want to have for my kids. I spent a lot of time being in the interview process for the next gig over and over again, and it's tiresome. And but I can see by the motions that are taking place with this administration how things can potentially get better. They don't see that. Many of these folks probably were in D.C. and they likely voted for Harris, who nobody voted to be the nominee. She was just made the nominee by the superdelegates. But a vote for her would have been a vote from bigger government more spending, more printing. The war in Ukraine going on longer, but let's see what this gal has to say.
Utterly devastated. I'm confused because my recent performance evaluation was exceptional and I got upwards of $1,500 as a bonus because
Yeah, I had that in my last W-2 position. I had exceeds expectations. And then they wanted to put me on a performance improvement program. I'm doing everything you're asking me to do, but eventually I left on my own accord. But I saw where that was going, and the government's good at just having a bunch of meetings and hiding behind that until push comes to shove. And then folks management starts to ask me, what have you been working on? I've been working on whatever you've been asking me to do. I would love to get to the point where we're actually implementing. In fact, I remember at one of my positions, I had to tell some folks in a meeting, this particular device probably costs, in my estimation, about $50,000. And they all seemed to have a silent heart attack when I mentioned that, even though when I looked around the room, the payroll of the people in that room had to be at least $2 million. But this one piece of equipment that you pay for once would last 15, 20 years. Its mean time between failure was at least that much. It was a Cisco device, and in my estimation, it was going to cost about that much. There were going to need to be 2 of them, and then a bunch of other sub switches across the plant. So it's interesting how they're concerned about some hardware, but not so much about the biggest cost, which can be the people. But let's continue.
my performance was so good and this was my dream job. And it's just being taken away by an administration who doesn't care about science. It doesn't care about people who might be homeless with their dog now. Hello.
All right, so she likely is a Democrat voter or a Harris voter or a Biden voter and doesn't like anything that's going to hold government accountable to the people. I've worked with folks and they said, well, we need to make sure that we're spending the taxpayers' money correctly. It was Milton Friedman, economist Milton Friedman, who said that there are 4 ways that you spend money. And this is the order of importance. The best way that you spend $1 is when you spend your money on yourself. It's going to be the most judicious way that you spend that money. The second way is when you spend your money on somebody else, like a spouse, a family member, a child, a charity. The third way is when you spend somebody else's money on yourself. Maybe you have an expense account at work, but it's somebody else's money on yourself. You're going to be somewhat judicious, but not as much as you would have with the first or second ways. And the fourth way is when you spend somebody else's money on somebody else, and that is government. It's the most wasteful way to spend $1. And the pipe, it's time to pay the piper at this point. We have to do something. It was unsustainable. It was making us weaker. It was hurting us from a national security perspective. And these folks are getting lost in the mix. Many of them look younger than me. This lady looks like a millennial, and maybe this was her first time for this to happen. But the government's big. You've worked there before. It's hard to get in. Once you're in, you'll probably find something else. So, I'm sorry to people who are losing their jobs, but we have to get this in order. And unfortunately, some eggs are going to get cracked. That's what they say in the private sector all day long. The company's got to survive, no matter what. So the country has to survive, no matter what. So I thought this was interesting. Maybe I'll look at more. But that's all for now. That's all I have to say about that. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.